My name is Heath Lambert, and I want to welcome you to a very special bonus episode of What Happened at First Baptist. We completed our 7-week regular podcast, and we have some extra bonus material that we're going to be dropping. And one of those pieces of extra information, one of those bonus episodes is going to be a special interview that I am having right now as we speak. I interviewed dozens of people for this podcast, but today I am here with my wife, Lauren Lambert. One of the things that I said to everybody that I interviewed is, hey, we're going to have a normal conversation and we'll just take bits and pieces of our conversation. But Lauren knows that this conversation is going to drop in its entirety. So we've got a couple of questions that I want to ask you. We've got a number of things that we want to talk about. But first, Lauren, I'm really glad you're here.
I'm really glad I'm here too.
All right. You are a unique interview. I've interviewed dozens of people for the podcast. You are in a different position than everybody else because you are a church member at First Baptist. You're not in leadership at the church in any way, but you are married to the senior pastor of the church. And so you're going to have a unique perspective on these things. And the first thing that I want to do is just as we try to get your personal perspective, your unique perspective on these things, is first, let's talk about you and I and our life together. How did we meet?
We met at Gordon College. I was a junior and you were a senior at Gordon when we met, just through some mutual friends. We dated for about 9 months before we got engaged and got married right after I graduated my senior year. We have been married for 20 years and have 3 kids. We've been through numerous church assignments and seminary, and right now we're raising teenagers. So this doesn't even seem like the hardest thing we've ever done, honestly.
Yeah, I mean, give me a real problem, would you? Yeah. Yeah, that's actually kind of true. Yeah, maybe we'll do a podcast in a few years called "What Happened at the Lambert Family." Once we get all these kids out of the house.
Yeah, good luck. That'll be about a 3-minute episode. I have no idea. Yeah, Lord help us.
That's right. So, how did we decide to get married? I mean, you're a nice, good-looking woman.
I mean, I looked so good. You were just like, Lauren.
You could have had anybody you wanted. Why did you beg me to marry you?
Oh my God. Is any of this going to be usable? Oh my goodness. Well, I think that the Lord I actually never had in my mind that I wanted to be a pastor's wife. I was never just like, my goal was to be a pastor's wife. So I always, when I talked to girls, which I did a lot when we were at Southern and Boys College, and we would talk about looking for a husband or what you would look for in a husband, I just told them that you need to look for a husband with qualities that were enduring, that you would want to experience in 20 years, someone who's thoughtful and kind and caring, who loves the Lord, who works hard, whose leadership you can get behind. And so obviously we had fun together, we dated, and that was a super fun season in our life. But also I just saw new things that 20, 30, 40 years down the line, I wanted to be around, and leadership I could get behind. So, and
now we are 20 years down the line.
Yeah, we are.
Yeah.
I was right too.
Well, that actually is one of the things I want to talk to you about before we get to what happened at First Baptist. I want to talk to you just in general about being a pastor's wife. Mm-hmm. So you knew when we were dating that marrying me was going to mean being a pastor's wife.
Yes.
And for our entire marriage, I've been in ministry for most of our marriage, I have been your pastor. Mm-hmm. I don't want to ask a question that's too vague. Tell me, what are some of the really awesome things about being a pastor's wife?
Yeah, I mean, I think that the Lord obviously calls you to the pastor, but he also calls me to be your wife in this specific life that we're living. Mm-hmm. And so he calls me to be a pastor's wife. And so I think that there's just commonality in mission. There is a common joy and love that we have towards our church. There is kind of a team effort in loving our church and being involved in our church and kind of orienting our life around the church that we're involved in. I think I have to be on board with that, or else there's going to be a lot of tension in our home. So I think the Lord uniquely calls me and prepares me and helps me to be able to do that and to do it with joy and not seeing it as a burden that's on my shoulders. I love our church. I've loved the churches that we've served in. There's been ones that are more challenging than others.
What's the name of the church that was the most challenging?
It's not even this one, to be honest.
No, I know it's not this. Yeah.
So, yeah, I think that there are unique challenges to that. And it's a lifestyle, really. To be a pastor's wife is just your life is going to be oriented around the people that you love and serve in your church, and that's great. There's also an element to which I keep things just running at home with our kids and our life, and that is a calling to me and a job to me to do that and to do it in a way that honors the Lord. So,
what would you say? And again, we're not talking about what happened at First Baptist, the subject of the podcast yet. We're just talking about general ministry and being a pastor's wife. What would you say is the hardest part about being a pastor's wife?
Yeah, the hardest part about being a pastor's wife is when people criticize your husband. I mean, you see your husband, I see you behind the scenes, and I see you up early in the morning praying, and I see you on the phone with people who need you at all hours. I see you here working hard and at the church, and I see your love and your care and your devotion to what God's called you to do. And then when people criticize you, one, I'm an extremely loyal person, and so I immediately want to defend you. But also, you realize that people see this one thing about you, and when people are upset about something, they pull your character out of context. So they take this one thing that they're upset about, and they almost forget everything else about you, and plow on and be upset. But they don't remember even the good things and the kindnesses and the graces that you've personally experienced with them. Those things just seem to fall away, where people almost have a "what have you done for me lately" attitude. And that's not the majority of people, but it does happen. And it is frustrating when I see the day in and day out, and I know your heart, and I know that how you're really making an effort to be faithful in what the Lord's called you to do. It's hard for me to handle that, I think.
Okay. Tell us something or some things about being a pastor's wife that normal church folks might not appreciate. They might not understand. What is there about being a pastor's wife that people might go, "Oh, I never thought about that before"?
Well, one thing is I think that a lot of people assume that I know things I don't know. So some pastors' wives work at the church. I do not work at the church. And I tease when they'll ask me some question about the inner workings of the church and just say, "I don't work here. I don't know." And I don't mean that to be snarky. I just really don't. I mean, I'm doing my own thing during the day.
And it's not like I'm coming home and giving you a briefing on every single thing that happened.
No.
Yeah.
And so, you're not reliving the workday when you get home. So I really don't know some of the things that are coming down the pipeline unless we've talked about it, which is not everything. I don't know people's personal problems if they've talked to you about them.
Yeah, I don't come home and download to you people's personal information.
And so you can always, with freedom, come and talk to me or say hello to me without feeling awkward if you've had a problem that you've talked to Heath about during the week, because that's not how we operate. And so I think that on one hand, people, they see your involvement at the church, and they see us here all the time because we love being involved at the church. But that doesn't mean that I know things about the inner workings or decisions that you're making or who's doing what. And so that's one thing I think people sometimes don't understand. I'm thankful that that's how it works in our home, because I get to enjoy our church family. I get to enjoy our congregation and not be burdened with some of the things that you're burdened with. So I think that's probably the biggest thing. I think too that we're a regular family. And so there are things at church that our kids are super excited about, and there are things that they're not because they're teenagers. And we have kind of a rule where we're committed to our church, and we want our kids to love and be committed to our church and to have their relationships in our church. And our life is oriented around our family and our family serving and loving our church. But also, we don't force our kids to do things they don't want to do. They don't have to try out for every solo. They don't have to come to every single event that happens. And we want that to foster a love for our church for them and have it not feel like it's a duty for them.
Okay, now let's start moving into First Baptist. So actually, one of the things we had this week in the podcast on lies, and one of the lies, you know about this, one of the lies that was shared is that I had always had this horrible ambition, this huge, overweening ambition to be a mega church pastor, be the pastor of a large church and make a real name for myself. And when we were thinking about whether we would come here, when Dr. Brunson offered to have me come and join him here, one of the main reasons that we almost didn't come was because of the size of the church. Yeah. Why don't you talk about your perspective on how the Lambert family got to First Baptist?
Yeah, so we were living in Louisville, Kentucky. You were a pastor at you were the executive director at ACBC at the time.
You're not lying, are you?
Hush your mouth. You were the executive director at ACBC. You were a professor at Boyce College and Southern Seminary. And honestly, we loved our life there. Our kids were in a great school. We loved our church. We went to Kenwood Baptist Church. It was a wonderful church. We had lots of friends in Louisville, and life seemed very joyful, and I felt productive in ministry. I felt like you were in positions where you were thriving. I felt like our kids were thriving. And so when they called us about coming down here to potentially talk about a job, I have to say my stomach kind of dropped. I just didn't want to go anywhere. I didn't want to do anything besides what we were doing. I loved our home. I even loved our little neighborhood. And so I initially was like, you don't even want a job. Why are we even going down there? And we repeatedly told them, hey, we're not looking for a job. We don't want to just come down and take a vacation on you. And they said, no, come down. We just want to talk to you about some things. So when you came down and you came back to the hotel room we were staying at after your conversation with Dr. Brunson and John Blunt, and basically told me what they said about a transition, about some mentoring with Dr. Brunson, I knew immediately that you would want to do that, because I knew that you love the church at large. I mean, we didn't know this church yet, but you love the church. You wanted to pastor. You have a pastor's heart, and we'd been in and out of ministry, some like in our marriage.
Churches.
Yeah, pastoral ministry. So you had mostly been in pastoral ministry for our marriage. And I knew that you desired to learn from older pastors who are in the ministry longer and wiser. And I think that you saw that as a really great opportunity to be able to do that with Dr. Brunson. So it kind of checked all of the boxes that I knew that you would be attracted to, that would appeal to you. But never in our whole life did we ever go to a mega church or feel like some kind of unique call to a mega church. I remember our first Sunday here, we walked in and it was 4th of July weekend, and there was a very patriotic service planned. And I looked at the choir and I was like, that looks like the size of our church in Louisville. This is so weird. It was very overwhelming.
Yeah, you turned to me and you shook your head and you mouthed, "No way."
Yeah, it was really overwhelming. I was like, I have no idea what we're doing here. And it was downtown and in a very different environment than we were used to being in. And so it just felt really uncomfortable to me. So we got here and I knew I had like a pit in my stomach thinking, I can feel the Lord calling us here and I don't want to go. And so we went home and talked to a number of people who gave us wisdom, who we talked to about it and were honest with about our feelings towards it. And they all told us to go. I was like, ugh, I actually don't respect you. Let's go talk to somebody else.
Yeah, people you were pretty sure were going to put a no vote in and help you out all said,
yeah, but you know how your life isn't getting turned upside down and shook? Can you think about it in those terms? Because that's what my life is about to do. So it just felt really obvious that the Lord was calling you here. And it felt obvious as time went on that I was kind of white knuckling our comfortable life. And I talked to a friend about it, and we were sitting by the pool at our little swim club. And she said, you know, the Lord did not bring you here to be comfortable. He brought you to train you up and to go out and to serve the church. And that's what you're going to do. And, you know, at Southern Seminary, our seminary hymn says we meet to part and part to meet. Right? Yeah.
Yeah. Uh-huh.
When earthly labors are complete. Yeah. And she said that to me and said, look, this is what we're doing, as we came here to do 20 years or 15 years ago. And this is the Lord sending you out. And I was like, okay.
Oh boy.
It was funny, but it was funny because a year or two ago, that friend got sent out from being at Southern for a long time. And she said, oh, wow, that must have been some special advice considering I never had to do it until now. So anyway, but it was good advice. And it was kind of confirmation from the Lord. Yes, this is wise counsel. This is the Lord saying, you know, this feels uncomfortable, but the Lord's calling you there.
Okay. So we come to Jacksonville and I really did walk away from everything comfortable. I walked away from my seminary job that I had loved. I resigned my leadership post at ACBC, which we loved and knew how to do, and had a lot of support in that job, and I walked away from it. And so then here we are. We've been at First Baptist for, about 18 months when I get elected as co-senior pastor. And then that following spring, when Dr. Brunson left to pursue other ministry, I was here alone. And there was this growing awareness, as I say in the podcast, there was this growing awareness that, my goodness, there are things that aren't working here. And, there are things that are bad here. And, there are things that are crippling here. And there was just this situation where we had a very faithful church that was in a practical bad state. Mm-hmm. Now, most of the people that I have interviewed are First Baptist lifers. And you've heard them say just over the years, you just saw fewer and fewer people show up. Over the years, you just saw the buildings get more and more in disrepair. Over the years, you saw Sunday school classes get consolidated, and we quit using this floor, and then that floor, and then this building, and then that building, and then this block. You heard just people watching gradually the decline. You are a member of the church. You love the church. Do you remember when you started, what your first awareness was that, oh my goodness, from the outside, this looks like just a great big church. But when you look a little closer, when you scratch beneath the surface, there are a lot of problems that are going to have to get fixed. Do you remember when you first started being aware of that?
Well, some of it was when you started doing a deep dive into kind of the condition of the church before you agreed to be here long term. So I did know some of it through that. Some of it was, there are some of the most committed Christians that go to First Baptist Church who serve their church, have done it faithfully for decades. But I did notice when we got here, one, that there was conflict and tension that did not seem healthy. And I always tell people we were able to come to this church because of the very peaceful, joyful, godly leadership at our previous church at Kenwood. And there was a sense in which things were unsettled, and there felt like there was some tension and conflict, especially in the leadership. I also think I noticed, which I don't notice anymore. It's funny. I noticed on Wednesday nights and sometimes on Sunday nights that there were people at church and their kids would be in programming and they would be not in a service or not in a teaching time. They would be sitting, hanging out with each other, not serving, just kind of waiting out their kids. And I actually saw that as a sign of the church being unhealthy. Like, if you are here, you should be serving or you should be learning and growing. You shouldn't be sitting and hanging out. I don't know. It just seemed weird to me that there were so many people doing that. Yeah. And it felt like there has to be a need for people somewhere in the church to be watching somebody else's kids or growing in their relationship with Christ and listening to the teaching. And I actually noticed that and thought, this doesn't seem good. There seems like you could almost, if you're coming to church and doing this, you could really take it or leave it and stay home. So I felt like that was kind of a sign. Also, I mean, when we got here, we were in a totally different environment than we came from. And when you come into downtown Jacksonville, and I it's funny because I think sometimes when you see something every single week, you don't notice some of the decay. And when we came in, I noticed the decay. Yeah. I was like, oh, this looks kind of like nobody's taking care of it.
Yeah, we were dropping off our kids and you were freaking out.
Yeah, I was like, is this safe? Are we going to be okay? And it wasn't in great repair, a lot of the spaces, especially, some of the student spaces were not in good repair. And I would go to my Sunday school class and the rooms were not in good repair. The smell, you could smell mold, things like that. And so I think sometimes you almost get used to that when you're here every week and it doesn't seem as bad. But when you come from something that's not that way into something that is that way, you're like, yikes, are we going to do something about this?
Yeah.
So,
you know what I remember? I remember our first week here as a family, and it was that arduous thing to drop off the kids. We went to the first floor and we filled out all the paperwork on the clipboard with the pencil. We dropped the kid off in the kind of weird situation. And then we got on the elevator, went up a level, filled out other different paperwork, dropped the kid off in another different weird situation, elevator up again. And then we went over into the Sunday school class that we tried to go in, and it smelled mold. You have asthma and you started coughing and having a problem in the room. And then we had to go pick up the kids and all the different levels we had to go pick up the kids at. And then we had to walk three blocks over to where the main auditorium was. We were late for church. We leave church and we walk, I think we had to walk 2 blocks over to where we were parked. We get in the car and you were quiet, and we get home and you ran into our house and took the stairs 2 at a time to go up and sob. And you were a nervous wreck about what we had just signed up for.
Yeah. And I mean, I told you if we hadn't just taken this job, I'd never go to this church.
That's right. And we talked about that if I were in Jacksonville to sell insurance instead of be the pastor, we would have 10 minutes into dropping our kids off, we would have stopped, we would have picked them back up, and we would have gone out for breakfast that Sunday, visited another church the following week, and told everybody, you don't want to go to this.
Our kids were so far away from each other at the beginning that one day I remember I went home, took a 3-hour nap in the afternoon. I was beat. I laid down, took a 3-hour nap, got up, went back to church, just from coming to church, bringing my kids where they needed to be, picking them up, going to church, doing the whole circle again, and then coming back Sunday and bringing them where they needed to go. I hit my 10,000 steps for the day. Like, I got my virtual high five from my Fitbit because I just took my kids to Sunday school. It was crazy.
So it's fascinating. So what you were noticing was, and I said this to the staff back then, hey guys, we're never going to know how many first timers with young kids show up,
just overwhelmed,
and just looked at each other and said, we're out of here. Mm-hmm. We'll never know how many people we lost just with that. But so you're talking about what I noticed as a mom, and I noticed just in relationships. I just noticed these problems. That was my first awareness. fixing problems. And, it's interesting. So from spring of 18, when I was trying to figure out how to do this on my own, to fall of 19, when a lot happened in that spring of 18 to fall of 19. We were trying, let's see if we can wait this out. Let's see, by the fall of 18, spring of 18, I'm on my own. By the fall of 18, hey, numbers are going up. And we haven't, if you look back historically, we haven't seen that here in a while. Let's see what happens with this. By the spring of 19, it was clear the growth was not going to be significant enough to offset all of the expenses we were going to, at least it wasn't going to be fast enough to offset all of the expenses with enough time. But in that season, we talked about how things seemed basically happy. People were in a good mood. Things seemed to be going in a basically good direction. We just had all of these underlying problems that had to be addressed. I announce in September of 2019 the big right size plan that's received well at first, but by the wintertime, things start to get bad. And then, of course, COVID happens and it went from bad to worse. Why don't you, just in your own words, what happened during the transition at First Baptist? How would you describe it to somebody?
During that 19, early 20 stage?
Anything you want. What happened here?
I think the biggest difficulty was change for some people. I think change is hard for everyone. Change is hard when you are a fan of what's going on. Change is hard when you just like to come and do your routine and do what you've always done. There are a lot of people who grew up in this church or have been here for decades that it actually wasn't hard for. I think some people assume that the change would be harder for the older people in our church who have been in a routine for so long. But those are the people really that I heard from saying, this isn't that hard. I remember Rita Browning telling me, Guy Nell used to tell us, everything changes except the message. The Bible stays the same, but you might get your room changed. You might get told to go serve somewhere else. Everything changes except the scriptures. And so that was a very common attitude, I felt like, with the older, mature members of our church. I think change is just hard. I think one of the biggest things where this came about was when the layoffs happened. So, like you said, everybody has a constituency. Look, people were part of this church and they were loved, and that is exactly how it should be. But that doesn't mean that the change isn't necessary. And so once it was kind of known that that was going to happen, I think there was just a lot of tension. People not knowing if they were going to keep their jobs, people thinking maybe they were or maybe they weren't, people talking to people that they were around a lot and speculating on things. And it just created a really hard environment here. I think it created kind of an adversarial thing. And you were doing it trying to be gracious and say, hey, I'm going to have to lay people off. So I want to give you a lot of notice so your family doesn't have hardship so that you can find a new job if you need to. But I think in retrospect, it created some unrest with people. And that made our relationships awkward. I mean, I didn't know who was getting laid off. I didn't know any of what was going to happen there. We hadn't talked about that. You spent months praying about that and trying to figure out what to do with personnel. And I didn't know that, but I think people thought I knew. I think people were just upset at the potential of them being let go. Nobody wants to be told that they're replaceable, and that's not what you're saying. It's just, look, our church has to totally reorganize in order to survive. And it's hard for people to handle. And there are just people who, like in every church, probably feel closer to certain pastors or certain leaders or certain employees. And so when that person's job goes away or the potential for them to leave arises, it becomes ugly and people start fighting for that thing rather than seeing a common goal and having unity as a church.
So when I say what happened, you're saying change happened and that change was really personal.
Yeah, change happened. It was really personal. It was a lot of change. I mean, we sold the main auditorium.
Yeah.
And that was a big deal. You know, I get it. People get attached to memories that happen in certain places. But I also saw the other side of it where it was hurting our church to try and keep things going like that. And it was just, our church's survival was dependent on making some of these changes. And really a benefit I had coming in was, by this point, I loved our church and I wanted our church to thrive. I didn't want us to be burdened with things that were going to make it difficult for us to thrive as a church, to do ministry, to serve the people that were here. And so I didn't have the personal attachment to those things, but I had the attachment to these people who I love and who I wanted to be in a better spot than they were in previously.
What would you, so there's a lot of ways to kind of chronicle the change. You could do it historically. You could do it even with events like when we made this announcement or we made this real estate deal or whatever. What for you was the low point?
The low point was right after the layoffs, right before the pandemic that shut everything down. I mean, there was a point, it was really close to when that happened. Those two events happened right together. I mean, within a month or something of each other. And people just got illogical about that. I mean, I remember reading on Facebook that, we weren't having church when church was canceled the first Sunday. Oh yeah, we're not going to have church because Pastor Heath doesn't want everyone meeting. He's trying to keep everybody from meeting because they were upset. And I was like, guys, Earth is closed. Like,
I didn't fly over to Wuhan.
Like people in California and Europe and everywhere, like no one's allowed to go anywhere. But I mean, the amount of power they thought you had was like crazy. I was like, wow, Heath shut the whole Earth down. But it was so, people were so upset that they like lost sense. It's like they lost their ability to even process the facts. Like clearly that wasn't what happened. I mean, the world was closing down. There was so much uncertainty. And so, but then people went home and they were stuck at home and they were on social media and they were texting each other and passing things around. And it was ugly. I mean, it was just ugly. And I really struggled with that. I had to get off of Facebook. I had to block people on Facebook. I made a commitment that I wasn't going to block anybody that didn't have my personal phone number. So if these people wanted to get in touch with me and be reconciled, they could. But I'm going to block.
But you knew people that had your personal information and were still roasting online.
Well, they were, but I blocked those people because I didn't want to see what they were saying because it was just really upsetting to me. And I also didn't want a laundry list of their sins against me and against you in my mind if they were to ask for forgiveness, because I felt like it would just turn me towards bitterness and not towards having a gracious, soft heart towards them. So I get it. People were upset. They were being sinful. It was terrible. I mean, the Lord was gracious and all of our kids go on I turned 10 trip with Dad, and Connor, it was his turn to turn 10 and you had gone on a cruise with him right before COVID had happened.
We
like
got
literally the week before.
We docked and 12 hours later, President Trump closed all cruise ships.
It was crazy. I was actually concerned you might get stuck in a boat. And I was like, oh my gosh. But
which wouldn't have been half bad.
Oh my goodness. But you had no internet and no way to communicate really. You said,
I didn't pay for the internet so I could just focus on Connor and we were going to have a great time.
Yes. And that was just the Lord's kindness, because that week there was an internet petition to have you fired. There were people all over just saying the most insane things. And I remember being at my mom's house, being up in the night, getting these text messages and look at this. And it was wild. And I was really thankful you weren't seeing it.
Well, I want to ask you about that. So you have an interesting perspective because you know me better than anybody.
Yeah.
You see me, you know more about me than anybody knows, you see more of me than anybody sees. And one of the things that has probably been the subject, I'm going to say the subject of most of the discussions in our home has been the crazy lies that we're told. Don't you think that's probably what we spent the most time talking about?
Yeah, I mean, just some of this stuff that comes out and you're like, where does that even come from?
Well, that's what I want to ask you about. So like, and we spent a week on lies. So I just want to spend one question on it here with you. So lies about he didn't really grow up the way he grew up.
Oh, yeah.
Lies about he's never been a pastor before. He's making all this up. And it's funny because you've been with me in my hometown, and you knew my mom before she died, and you knew my dad, and you've met my biological father, and you know my twin brother and my older brother. You know all of these people. You've been in the churches where we supposedly never were.
Yeah.
And what is it like for you to have lived and seen and experienced the truth, and then have crazy people purvey that what you know and experience and have seen is not true? How do you do that as a pastor's wife?
So first of all, I do live with you, and I know all these things aren't true. And so that, on the one hand, I mean, I just look at this and I think, how do you come up with this stuff? But also, I think something really helpful, I talked to another pastor's wife who's older and a wise and gracious person that spent time talking to me. And she said something to me that has stuck with me. And it's that you just have to look at this. And even though it feels personal, it is spiritual. Like, it's all spiritual. And so, you know, we don't fight against flesh and blood, but against powers and principalities. And so that's what it is. It's interesting because other pastors that we've talked to that have gone through difficult transitions, so many of the tactics are the same. So many of the things that happen, like they can finish your sentence about things. And I think that's just further evidence that this is spiritual. This is sin grabbing hold of people. This is divisive. I mean, what feels like demonic activity where people who you think are committed to Christ are so angry and so upset about whatever their issue is that they will lie and they will gossip and they'll slander and they'll send crazy messages to family members asking if this is really true. And I mean, it's actually horrible that you would go to such lengths and spend your time. I mean, I looked at women who were calling and trying to fact check us at churches we were at, and people that were messaging family members saying, is this really true? I mean, like,
people who aren't, like family members who aren't even Christians, getting roped into.
Right. And I just think, you know what? This is a sad situation that this is how you spend your time. And this is what you're committing your thought life to. And this is what you're obsessing over when you're sitting at home. Like, it's a sad thing. And those people, it's a spiritual battle. Those people need Jesus. Like, they need Jesus to transform their hearts so that they don't spend their time trying to destroy other people, trying to figure out some way that they might be able to catch you in some weird thing.
You're going to be the one person that figures out what this guy's been covering for decades.
It's crazy. Yeah. And so obviously it's crazy. So there's a part of it where you're just like, whoa, this is nuts. But then also it's just such a spiritually dark thing that it feels burdensome because it's such a dark spiritual thing. But it also is, you have to look at it like that. Like, these people are so enslaved to whatever this sin is that they're holding on to.
Yeah. Okay. So I want to press in on this just a little bit different. Here's the thing. I want to talk to you as a minister's wife. Mm-hmm. That's what you've been since the day we said I do. You've been a minister's wife. And I want you to know that I think in this interview, perhaps the people you'll be the most helpful to are other ministers' wives.
Sure.
So you're a minister's wife talking to other ministers' wives. And I want to talk about, this could be just a little bit awkward, but we'll make it through. I want to talk about other ministers' wives. Okay, so we have seen over the years pastors' wives engage in bad activity online. They get online and they say whatever they want to say. Sometimes it's really obvious comments. Sometimes it's really sideways, snarky, kind of pokey comments. But it's intended to derail. It's intended to divide. It's intended to destroy. And we have both spent our fair share of being shocked that a pastor's wife would get online and devote energy to destroying something that her husband had spent so many years building. Now, we're not naming any names here, but you have been very, very careful not to ever do that. You don't get online and you don't say bad things about people. You don't get online and you don't say bad things about events. But you said right when we started talking, the hardest thing about being a pastor's wife is when people say bad, untrue things about your husband. Mm-hmm. And you also said the lowest point is when people are getting online and doing these kinds of things. But you have not returned fire with fire. I want to know why. Because there'd be times when you just get online and say, hey, here's Lauren Lambert. I'm going to set the record straight. There've been times when you could have there've been times when you've been holding that phone in your hand wanting to do it, but you've never done it. And I want to know why you don't do it. And I want to know, since you don't do it, what you do to keep you from doing it.
Sure. So one, I am a Christian and I want to act like a Christian. I don't think it serves our church. It's not loving to the people in our church or to the watching world to get on Facebook or Instagram or anywhere else and tear anybody down or get into some mudslinging match with somebody who's got a beef. There's just no benefit of that. That's not how problems get solved. That's not how people are reconciled. None of those things happen over social media. And so I just think I don't want to engage in that. I want to serve our church by not doing that. I also think really there were times when I just had to not look at social media because it was too hard to not respond if I was just constantly seeing all of these crazy things and things being said about you, things being said about our church, people in our church. And I had to just remove it from my sight. Honestly, I had to take it out of my sight. And I think that, look, I have the Spirit inside of me. And so I was just asking the Lord for self-control, for kindness, for patience. I have a friend who texted me on one of the days that was really hard. And she said, honey, I'm checking on you. Don't look at social media. And then she sent me the verse that says, Lord, put a guard upon my mouth. And I said, she said, just keep quiet, put your head down, trust the Lord. And that's really something I just kept repeating to myself. This is not going to serve our church. This is not going to convince anybody. All this will do is really look poorly towards my character. Mm-hmm. It doesn't look, it's not becoming, just as a Christian woman, to get on and feel like I've got to poke people online. So I think I've really tried to remove myself from that when it feels like it's getting too hard. And I also think, look, when all of this stuff was going on, you were in a lot of personal turmoil. You were working really hard to serve our church faithfully in the midst of some really difficult times. Our kids were experiencing a lot of difficulty. They were feeling the tension. They were feeling a lot of the relational difficulty with friends leaving our church. And I had plenty to do besides go on Facebook and have an argument with somebody. Yeah. So there's a calling on my life to be your wife and my kid's mom and to really do that in a way that honors the Lord. And one, that wouldn't set a good example for them. But two, I had people in my home I needed to shepherd and love and care for.
Let me ask you about that. So on the mistakes episode that I recorded, I confessed that I think one of my sins was that instead, I gave you guys a veto. Hey, if you need to go, we'll go. But I decided that was more passive leadership and I should have been more active. And the right thing to have done would have been to say, we're just leaving. I've confessed that sin to the Lord. I've confessed that sin to you. Mm-hmm. I've confessed that sin to each one of our kids. When I put this out there on the mistakes episode, we got a lot of email about this, a lot of questions about this. I took some of the questions from Spencer during one of the Q&A podcasts. But a lot of interest in that. You and all three of our kids were very gracious to say, hey, look, if you're asking for forgiveness, I forgive you. But I actually don't think that was a sin on your part, and I'm glad we are here. Talk about that.
Okay, so first of all, I think we loved our church, and we were on board with the mission of serving our church. And so when our church was hurting, we were hurting. It wasn't just because there were things pointed directly at us. It was our church is hurting and we're hurting. I think we also all saw the sinful nature of the personal attacks and the attacks on our church and people trying to convince other people to leave and trying to take up offenses that were not theirs. And it was almost like, okay, if we let these people like win and with these dirty, sinful tactics and these things that are just divisive so that they can come in here and I guess do whatever they want to do with the church, that's so wrong. Like, I think there's a sense in which all of us wanted to stand up for righteousness and for the people here that were experiencing the difficulty. Like, I think that there was a sense in which we're like, hey, this can't be what our church becomes. Like, we can't leave the church here without a pastor, without in such a difficult time, and have this be what happens. I mean, it would have been too painful for me to say, yeah, it's time to leave, because then what happens? And then if it works that time, what happens to the next guy that comes in?
Yeah.
I mean, it's just going to start a wicked cycle of like, let's grab control or something. Let
me push in on that personally, because I've told the story on this podcast. You and I talked when we were interviewed for the Glass House with Mandrells about, there was this one season when I got those 2 job offers. And ever since I've been here, I've had those 2 standing job offers. And so we were sitting there one afternoon and I had 5 options. I could stay put or I could take one of the 4 job offers.
Right.
All of those job offers were paying more money than what I was making here. All of those job offers offered the promise of being easier than the turmoil we were going through here. You were talking about not training the church that they can get their way by mistreating the pastor, training bad actors that if you just want to run somebody off, just behave this way. But very personally, you're a wife and you're a mom, and your husband could go make more money and have an easier time of it. And you told me very clearly, we cannot leave. What are you thinking as a wife and a mom when you say that?
Yeah, I mean, it was personally difficult. It was personally challenging. There were things that I did to alter our life here. We had to pull out of some things. We had to pull the kids in really close. We had to shelter them from things that were going on. There were things that I didn't allow the kids to go to, like open mics, that we said, I'm just going to stay home. Because I didn't want their impression of the Church of Jesus to be the ugliness that was happening. Now, to be honest, Q&As, people who are bad actors don't go to Q&As and ask questions. They just go online and say nasty things about you.
So true. They never show their face.
It doesn't matter how available you make yourself. If you're not communicating in good faith, you're just not going to be open and try and resolve things, because that's not your goal. Your goal is not restoration or resolution. It's to burn something down. So I think for me as a wife and mom, yeah, it was really hard. It was painful. It was awkward to walk into rooms. It was really hard to shepherd our kids. And there were lifestyle choices with our children that we had to make in order to survive it.
And you decided to stay and not go because
I felt the Lord really called us here.
Okay.
I felt like the Lord was telling us to stay, that he'd given us work to do that we weren't done doing yet.
Okay, so now this very important question. Again, you're a minister's wife. I think the group you're going to be most helpful talking to are other ministers' wives. So ministers' wives listening to this out there, not everybody should stay.
No.
Right? We decided to stay in the teeth of a mess. But there's going to be some situations where you do need to take that job offer.
Yeah.
Or you do need to put your resume out or whatever. If you were talking to ministry wives here, how would you tell them to think that through?
Well, one of the things that I would say is that the church was not a majority of people who were bad actors. The church was mostly people who love the Lord and serve the Lord with joy and unity. And so there were so many people in our church that encouraged us, that prayed for us, that made contact weekly, daily, and said, I love you. I'm praying for you. The Lord is going to work in this church. I know he is. I'm praying for protection for your family. People who were loving and serving our family constantly in the midst of this really difficult time. I mean, people who were giving me wise counsel, people who were just helping me to know I wasn't crazy and saying, this is really bad and I'm so sorry. And so I think that's part of how the Lord kept us here at First Baptist, was just really godly, faithful people who were the majority of the people at this church who held us up, who encouraged us, who served alongside us, who took heat alongside of us, who lost friends alongside of us. Those people were in it with us. So I think if you are at a church where you're hard pressed to find people who are in it with you, then maybe it's time to go.
Okay.
But I do think that we had that here. Like, it was very hard and it was there was a lot of turmoil, but there was also a lot of sweetness and a lot of courage that we saw with the people in our church who stood with us, people who put their head down and served, people who had hard conversations with church members who were hearing things that were not true, or who were hearing things that were speculative. And so I think that's something that the Lord used to just carry us and sustain us and to keep us here.
I was a faculty member, still am a faculty member at Southern Seminary, but that was one of my main gigs for 10 years when we lived in Louisville. And you spent a lot of time talking to ministers' wives and future ministers' wives about how to be a supportive, helpful ministry wife. There's all sorts of things to say under that general category. Here, I want to ask you a more specific question. When, again, this is for ministers' wives, when they see their pastor husband under fire, when they are going through the ringer in a season of change, what advice would you give to ministers' wives about how they could be helpful and supportive in such a time of trial?
Yeah, I think the first thing I would say is to pray for your husband and just plead with the Lord on his behalf that he would, there are many nights going to bed that I did this, that I would just beg the Lord to protect you, to spare you, because I knew how much personal hurt that you were dealing with, that he would bless the work of your hands, even in difficult times, that he would bring unity to our church, that he would bring joy to our church. That I just remember praying for you and for our church. And I think knowing that my friend Tanya York says, you're never neutral. Like, you either diminish your husband's ministry or you compliment him. And so, part of having self-control and in these kinds of situations is, look, your husband doesn't need something else to deal with. He doesn't need you to go off the rails because you're just so upset about something. That's an area where you can trust the Lord and say, look, the Lord is going to sustain us. The Lord knows the truth. The Lord knows that we are trying to be faithful and obedient to him. And so I can put my head down. I can love and support my husband. I can fill in gaps where he needs me to. I can encourage him. I can pray for him. I can serve alongside him at the church. And I can leave this other stuff to the Lord to sort out, because the Lord is the one who has to bring unity and restoration and joy to this church. All I can do is be faithful with the next thing that he sets in front of me.
Last question. So this has been a cold interview. I didn't give you any heads up. You didn't know what I was going to ask, but I know you're going to be eager to answer this question because here you talk about it all the time. So it's been a long season of change in a church that we love, in a church that's faithful, but a long season of change. Actually, two questions real quick. When did it feel to you that things were really different, and how could you tell?
I would say shortly after we came back from the pandemic, because there was just a sense of unity, and the people that were here were happy to be here. They were thrilled to be out of their homes. They were thrilled to be back at church. They were thrilled to see each other. And it had kind of woven together in unity the people who came back. Like, they saw this stuff, and people who had eyes to see, who spiritually were mature, looked at some of the stuff that had gone on over those few months and thought, man, this is ugly. I don't want to be a part of that. Even if they didn't know what happened, they were like, that just looks ugly, and I'd rather not be a part of it. And so when we came back, the Lord was just, I feel like the Lord kind of reset our hearts, and it felt different. And we had a lot of new people showing up to church. So we came back, and some churches were back and some weren't. And so people just thought, I want to go to church. And they came back, and the Lord added to our numbers. And it was a sweet thing, and it was encouraging to us as we came back to see new faces. And so
as I'm talking to you here at the end of 2023, it's September of 2023. So by your accounting, it's different. People put it at different. I say it really felt different to me when I came back from that first brain surgery in September of 2020. But so sometime middle to late 2020 is when it seemed like things had leveled out. Now here we are. We're 2 years on the other side, and in God's kindness, the right size plan has worked. It didn't work exactly in every detail the way we thought it would, but it has worked, and we got a united staff, and we've got an energized church, and we're living within our means. And it's for 2 years, we've been making progress and not just solving problems. Last question. What is going on at First Baptist that is exciting? What are the great things that you're seeing at First Baptist in these new days?
Oh my goodness. There's so many good things going on at First Baptist. The Lord has knit our hearts together in unity. It's a joyful place to be. It's a sweet place to be. We are seeing growth in so many areas. I mean, I see growth spiritually in our church, just in maturity and in love of God's word. First Baptist has always been a church since we've been here, and I know before we've been here, for years and years. The benefit they've had, like you've said, faithful preachers who taught this church how to love the Bible. And so that is something that we continue to see, people who love the Bible, who want to grow in God's word. So that's always encouraging. There are people serving at our church all the time. People who jump in to serve our kids, who are doing kids choir, who are doing youth ministry, who are singing in the choir. I sing in the choir now, the choir that I thought was dauntingly big when I got here. I sing in the choir now. And a growing choir and orchestra. Just so many things that are so sweet to see the Lord adding to our numbers, but doing it amidst a group of people that are here who are joyful in their service to our church, maturing and growing in their relationship with Christ, unified in their relationships with each other. It's just a sweet season to be at First Baptist Church.
Isn't that the truth? Well, Lauren Lambert, my wife, listen, I have interviewed, every interview has been helpful. Every interview has been interesting. There have been a lot of people I have interviewed, and without their help and support, it would have been hard to make it. But you are the only You are the only person that I've interviewed without whom it would have been impossible to make it. So I'm thankful and I love you.
Love you too.